Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Marisa Brown. I have the pleasure of introducing Richard So today, who will be sharing his new research with us. Richard is an assistant professor of English and cultural analytics at McGill University. He works at the intersection of cultural analysis and data science, using data-driven methods to study culture and issues of race, power, and inequality. He is the author of Trans-Pacific Community, published by Columbia University Press in 2016, and Redlining Culture, a data history of racial inequality and post-war fiction, also published by Columbia Press in 2020. That is a data-driven study of white supremacy in post-war US publishing and literature. Currently, he's working on a new book that studies the impact of social media and user-generated content on how we talk about race and tell stories about race, which combines cultural criticism and data science. Dr. So received his BA from Brown in literature and economics and his PhD in English and comparative literature from Columbia. At McGill, he co-directs the Text Lab, a digital humanities and cultural analytics initiative, and is the digital humanities section editor for Public Books. He writes for academic audiences and the public and has written on cultural analytics for the New York Times, The Atlantic, Slate, and the New Republic. In addition to the book he's working on now, Dr. So is also working on several collaborative studies of how including one of how the media has told the story of racial protests over the last 6 years, which is grounded in data analysis. At McGill, he teaches courses on digital humanities, cultural studies, and Asian American and Asian Canadian literature. He taught previously at the University of Chicago and Williams College. That is a long intro. I could go on because there's so many interesting projects and sort of research projects that he's involved with. But we are so pleased now to turn it over to Dr. So to have this opportunity to both welcome him back to Brown, even if virtually, for him to share his work. And we're excited to have you here. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much. I'm really pleased, happy to be here. Thank you so much to the center, Marisa, Stephanie, and especially Soraya McPherson for organizing this virtual visit. It's really cool to be back at Brown, however, remotely, as Marisa mentioned. I did my undergraduate degree here, and it was really some classes I took sponsored through the center, classes with Dan Kim, especially, who is my mentor as an undergraduate, is the reason I became a professor, or at least I was able to get into graduate school. None of that would have happened if I had not gone to Brown and taken classes at this, through the center. So it's really cool to be back. I have a number of slides, so I'm just gonna get into it. Let me first share my screen. Okay. Great. And of course, thank you to all of you for coming. Really appreciate your time. I'll try to be concise. And if you have any questions about the slides, I can't see anyone, so just please speak up if you need me to repeat something or something is malfunctioning. So the talk is focused on my book. I'll be presenting just pieces of it. And I should mention too that this talk is more for a kind of general audience, informed, educated audience, rather than fellow professors, literary scholars. But I have lots to say to that audience in the Q&A. So if you have questions or concerns from a kind of disciplinary standpoint, I'll be glossing over those issues, but happy to talk about that in the Q&A. This is more for, again, a general audience. So one of the major questions of the book is why is publishing so white? So I'm going to present a part of this research from the book, working through some questions. Sorry, let me. So the puzzle that really started this project was a bit of cognitive dissonance regarding two pretty well-known narratives. The first is the purported victory of multiculturalism in the arts in the post-war period, especially in the United States, particularly in fiction. This is something that scholars, we all tend to believe, is taught in the universities, that multiculturalism was a thing that happened in the 80s and 90s, and it was successful. The second narrative is regards the dominance of white supremacy in the arts, specifically publishing, Hollywood, even music in the United States in the current moment, and particularly in the literary cultural industry, like fiction. The first, of course, is a scholarly academic narrative. The second is a narrative emerging grassroots from the ground up from writers and artists. And there's this cognitive dissonance, like how can these two narratives be true at the same time? But just as, again, a review of the purported victory of multiculturalism, these are some quotes that I've gathered over the last few years regarding this story. And these are non-ironic quotes. These are sincere statements of perceived facts. So David Palumbo, the victories of ethnic literature, Michael Barabay in 2005, we are all multiculturalists now, and African-Americanist Darrell Dixon Carr, commenting that between in this period constitute the most productive and successful period in African-American literary history. So this is the first narrative I want to point out, the so-called purported victory of multiculturalism. The second is what I call the view from the ground, the grassroots perspective. So this is from an article in 2020, a study called The Overwhelming Whiteness of the Publishing Industry, and reports that a new survey examining the race and gender makeup of the publishing industry reveals what many writers and readers have long suspected. Much like Hollywood, the publishing industry is overwhelmingly white. And these are just some numbers, and the race figure it really stands at about 80% white Caucasian. So the problem that jumped out to me about 4 or 5 years ago is that there seems to be a major discrepancy between the narratives that scholars have established about post-war literature and the arts and the actual perceptions and experiences of authors regarding multiculturalism versus racial inequality today. And the task that I felt that was before me was, how do we resolve this discrepancy? And how do we better understand how and why authors so strongly perceive and experience racial inequality in white hegemony? And now I'm going to start moving into, sorry, let me actually close this window because it's getting kind of loud. So I'm going to start now moving into a bit of the findings and the major arguments of this book I wrote that was in response to this puzzle I really want to address. The first question is, what actually happened? So just sort of quantitatively, just counting things, really basic, simple things, what actually happened? And working with a bunch of other people and institutions, we collected a ton of data, and this is what we found. So mainstream publishing in this period is about 97% white. Book reviews, just to get who gets reviewed in like the New York Times, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, 90% white. Bestsellers, really staggeringly, is 98% white based on Publishers Weekly information. And book prizes, which also surprised me, is 91% white in this period, the ostensible post-war period, 1950 to 2000. So just again, counting just in terms of what happened in this period. This is one account of what happened. And so the one conclusion we can draw from this data is, starting with mainstream book publishers like Random House, then onward to book reviews and bestseller lists and prize winners, looking at the entire life cycle of a novel from its publication to its reception, the American literary field in this period has one dominant and salient feature, and that's total whiteness, right? And again, as I pointed out, when we move through the life cycle of a book, from publishing to reception to recognition, that whiteness doesn't really attenuate at all. And as I'm going to show in a later graph, what's most important is that these numbers are relatively unchanging over time. We see little blips and little peaks, but I want to stress that there's no upward curve to any of these trends, which is perhaps the most surprising thing, that we would have assumed that as we reach the 80s, 90s, we'll see an attenuation of this whiteness, but we actually don't. The data does not indicate that. So the question is, so what did change? So what changed actually is the classroom. As a proxy for what gets taught in college classrooms, we can look at the racial breakdown of authors in the Norton Anthology of English Literature. So we look at a Norton published in 1979, it's 81% white, 90% Black, and kind of shockingly, 0% Asian American, Latino, Latinx, Indigenous. There are no Asian Am, Latinx, or Indigenous writers in the 1979 Norton. By 2016, though, we see a big transformation, a redistribution of attention. If you look at a 2016 Norton, after the multiculturalism waves in the 80s and 90s, is 61% white, 21% Black, and most significantly, 18% Asian American, Latinx, Indigenous. So something that really did change. And what changed is what gets taught at the university in English department classrooms and literature departments and so forth, using the Norton as one proxy for that. So yes, starting in this period in the 80s, more faculty of color hired to teach courses in African American, Asian American, Native American literatures. So by the time that I went to Brown in the late 90s, I could take a class in Asian American literature with Professor Kim, which was awesome. There are more courses in these areas, curricula and syllabi start changing, and more students are reading books like Beloved and Chiang Mai-Lee's Native Speaker. And then, of course, there's more faculty, more scholarship focused on race and literature and culture is getting produced. So this is what was happening. The university was dramatically changing. The dissonance, however, is these graphs are a little bit hard to see, but I just want to focus, I just want to draw your attention to how they look different, how they have different trend lines. The top graph is the percentage of white versus non-white authors getting published at big five publishers, 1950 to 2000. In the bottom graph, using a method that I don't have time to get into, but it records a percentage of articles in scholarly journals, particularly literary and cultural studies journals like PMLA, Critical Inquiry, Representations, focused on race topics. So in technical terms, I use a topic modeling algorithm to look at everything in JSTOR. And the thing that I want to draw your attention to, what's important here is that the top graph is really flat and it's unchanging, and the bottom graph, there's a clear upward trend. There's an increase, especially as we get to the 90s, in the year 2000 and beyond. There's an obvious increase in articles focused on talking about race and novels by minority authors, and that's, to me, the real dissonance. The gap is in the world outside the university, it's flat. And there's one line that's way taller than all the other lines. And in the university, we see a kind of exponential growth in people writing about and talking about race, especially in classrooms. So how did this happen and what can we do about it? Now, so I did a lot of research, worked with a lot of people, and wrote a book to try to start figuring out this question. And the question to me, like the so what, right? Why is this question important? It's important to me because in my view, the scholarly misperception of the so-called multicultural revolution in the arts and society erased from view the problem of white hegemony in this period. And the job of scholars, I believe, is to address such problems. That our first job as scholars is to respond to real problems in the actual world. But the problem is, if you can't see the problem, then you can't help address and fix it. So it's possible that scholars were not working on this problem because they didn't fully note that it existed. And this is consequences because it means the problem just gets worse over time. And in my view, I believe the current problem with hegemony in the arts has become so severe because we never fully understood the intensity of the problem and thus attacked the problem in the first place decades ago. So to me, this is why this is a real issue. So I'm going to summarize just two things I talk about in the book. I make a bunch of claims and a bunch of arguments in the book that I invite you to check out. But there are 2 points. There's 2 insights or arguments that I want to foreground to help start explaining how did this happen? Why is the literary field so white? Why is publishing so white? I have 2 major claims in addition to a bunch of smaller ones in the book. But for this, I just want to draw your attention to the 2 important ones, I think. So the first claim or insight is racial inequality in the arts is unusually sticky, meaning that it's really, really hard to change. So the first discovery is yeah, racial inequality whiteness in the arts is unusually sticky, meaning it's extremely hard to change. And the metaphor I'd use is, you can think of it as like it's trying to bend the direction of a river. The problem is that periodically we see micro changes that do make some impact, but it's not enough to change the direction of the larger river in a meaningful way. The problem is humans cognitively tend to focus on these short-term changes because it's hard to discern the overall shape of the river over decades. We just naturally, as close readers, as the way we focus on things, we tend to focus on micro, seemingly explosions. So really, when a Black or Asian writer wins like a major literary prize, that's what we tend to focus on. But the danger is that we can mistake that for larger structural change. And this is true, of racial discrimination across, I think, many different fields. That's really, really hard to change an entire institution at a structural level. And we often confuse, again, micro changes for big changes. And I find in the world of the arts, this is particularly true. So here's an example. So this is a pretty striking graph to me, and this is in the book. Many of you know, I assume you all know Toni Morrison. You may know that in the beginning of her career, she was a very important and distinguished editor at Random House, one of the big five publishers between 1967 and 1983, where she helped to publish dozens of Black authors. So like Gail Jones, Toni Cade Bambara, a bunch of really important Black writers. The thing that I think no one ever knew, and when we published part of this in the New York Times, people at the Times, I didn't believe this. Like, we had to validate this data many times. But basically, what's really crazy about this graph is that you can see as soon as she leaves in 1983, the press goes back to not really publishing any Black authors. So you can see as soon as she gets hired, there's a change. And for her tenure, there's way more Black writers getting published. But as soon as she leaves, the institution unconsciously just regresses to its mean of not really publishing any Black authors. And this is just really crazy to me. When I first saw this, when I was doing this analysis, I couldn't believe it. But that's just how cultural institutions work. They're not, I don't think they're deliberately trying to do this, but as soon as they lose their one Black or Asian American editor, they will always find a way to regress back to the average, which is always a kind of white supremacy. So me, I don't really have time to talk about now. I do a lot of what we call literary text mining, looking at the actual doing quantitative analysis of thousands of books, pretty much all these books that Random House published in this time. We can also look at the contents of the book, not just information about the demographics of the authors, but actual text analysis. And happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, but when you isolate, when you're looking at how Black people, Black characters are represented in these novels in this period, which again is 97% white, you can see that on average in the aggregate, how Black people are getting represented in these novels is rather derogatory, and unchanging is the main thing. So again, the impact of Morrison was not to change the shape of the river in terms of also cultural representation. So not only who gets published at Random House, but also the kinds of stories, how they think about racial representation is also not changing. This sort of like sea of white authors just sort of swallows up the tiny percentage of non-white authors that are getting published at places like Random House. So again, you can see over time there's no clear evolution to the representation of Black characters. So this is what I want to say. Scholars and writers rightfully celebrate Morrison's time at Random House, which I think is great, and it's true. She had a major impact. But we perhaps overestimate its power in changing the overall whiteness of a large publisher like Random House, right? To me, any powerful institution will always bend towards inequality. As soon as she leaves Random House, the publisher regresses to its pre-1968 levels of Black authorship, about 1% per year. And as I just showed you, at the same time, my text mining analysis shows that despite publishing more Black authors in this period at scale and across the board, this uptick was not enough to change the aggregate representation of Black people in fiction. That representation remains largely stereotypical and stable. So even as we're publishing, really great writers like Toni Cade Bambara, again, the overall shape of what the publisher, how they think about race and the kind of stories we're publishing is relatively unchanging. Okay, here's the second big claim I wanted to focus on. I call it the problem with known quantities. So a second discovery I made is that editors, as well as book reviewers and prize committees, are interested in racial diversity, but that usually means only being interested in a very specific individual type of non-white and or Black author, someone like Toni Morrison, who's obviously exemplary. Writers like Morrison and, say, Maxine Hong Kingston are what we call known quantities, individuals who stand in for a broader demographic and become an alibi for diversity. The problem is that, again, cognitively, we focus so much on individuals, we don't see that elevating one or two Black or Asian writers doesn't mean fixing the bigger problem. The success of a few doesn't mean a broader success, and it definitely does not mean a broader transformation of structural racial inequality. It doesn't mean the institution is actually changing in a deeper sense. So here's a quantitative empirical way to think about it, and this is important. So 90% of non-white authors at Random House are published in the literary fiction category. So that's stuff like Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad, what we consider serious, like Philip Roth, Joyce Carol Oates, like writers like that. Most of those authors get big advances and get promoted well, and they often go on to win prizes and get reviews. So they're very visible. Here's the thing though, 90% of the fiction at Random House is published in other categories though, like young adult, romance, science fiction, right? Like stuff like Game of Thrones, right? Like whatever, Star Wars, right? That's actually the stuff that really drives Random House and other big publishers. So non-white authors are highly visible, but numerically they're actually tiny and structurally marginalized in publishing, right? So the real question is, like, where are the Asian American mystery authors, right? Where are the Black YA authors, young adult authors? Again, that's important because that's 90% of what publishing is all about. So actually serious literary fiction is not how they make their money. They make their money through stuff like young adults, stuff like Harry Potter and stuff like Game of Thrones. So this analysis helps to explain the structural reasons for the persistence of what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie calls a danger of a single story. The idea that a single type of story represents the entire humanity of a kind of people, i.e. say Kingston's Woman Warrior, a story of Asian women represents all Asian women, or that Asian women can only write one kind of story. The problem here is that the publishing industry is structurally set up to sustain this, right? That, again, if you look at this previous slide, right, just how the numbers play out, they are isolating minority writers to a single category, literary fiction within publishing. That's actually a very small part of publishing overall. And the extra danger is because authors like Kingston are so visible, like they win prizes, they get reviewed in the New York Times, they get taught in colleges, we believe that minority writers are more abundant and represented than they are. Again, they are relatively well represented in literary fiction, but pretty absent in the rest of the 90% of what gets published and actually read, right? So you can ask yourself, right, can you name a prominent Black fantasy writer? Can you name a prominent Asian American YA author? Can you name a prominent Latinx or Indigenous romance author? I can't. And if you can't, then it means that there's this deeper structural problem that's actually really punishing minority writers in the areas of publishing that tend to really make money, that are actually the important part of publishing in the literary field in general. Okay, so where does this leave us today? So, racial inequality, it's really important and people really care about today, like Oscar so white, publishing so white. However, history tells us that we've been here before and that while change is possible, change also tends to be incredibly ephemeral, as we saw with some of those graphs, incredibly passing. And again, I mean, this is great. So universities are hiring more person of color scholars to teach literature and topics focused on racial inequality and social justice. This is obviously fantastic and salutary. However, history tells us that a lot of the cultural studies scholarship that emerges from such efforts tend to be blind, or at least not directly taking on the broader structural problems that exist in culture and society. And as a result, they're not fully able to resolve those problems. So to me, we're back in the 80s, and what's happening with universities, the concern with diversity in the arts. Like, this is good, it's good we're working on this problem again, but we have to learn from the past. and also the failures of the past. Getting to the end here, just again, as a more wonky academic thing, I work in this new field called digital humanities, cultural analytics. In my book, I also make a big deal of that I really believe we need new methods to study culture and literature in the context of race and inequality. We need, to me, a reconciliation between qualitative and quantitative approaches. I think that our traditional methods of close reading, historicism, they're extremely powerful, really effective, but they're not fully sufficient to the task at hand. And quantitative computational methods give us a new cognitive view that allows us to overcome some clear blind spots. And part of the book is to say that, yeah, we clearly have some blind spots, and that's not inherently bad. It's how our disciplines have worked, but we have an opportunity now to think about these problems in new ways. And I hope to show in the book that because we didn't engage with these methods in the 80s and 90s, that's what caused some of these lacuna in knowledge and blind spots. And I would like to avoid that moving forward. The metaphor I use is this idea of cultural redlining. So something probably that everyone in this audience knows well about is this process of economic redlining. It just was a process, the practice in the pre and post-war period where banks would essentially identify so-called at-risk neighborhoods, which tend to be predominantly Black and non-white and poor. This is a map of Oakland, Berkeley, but they also did this in Hyde Park in Chicago and also Harlem in New York. And they basically drew a red line around Black and poor neighborhoods, indicating places that they wouldn't give loans to. And the consequence of that were profound in that they lead to the financial evisceration of these communities. That's why they couldn't start businesses. It was really devastating. And that was called economic redlining. And there's been a lot of work on this. The journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates recently drew attention to this. And to me, I'm really inspired by this work because it uses a mixture of qualitative and quantitative methods to see at scale patterns of racial inequality. And I want to ask a question for humanities scholars, literature scholars. Can we create a similar map that depicts the unequal distribution of the coveted resources of culture, namely opportunity and recognition? So I kind of want to move this metaphor and practice of studying economic redlining to studying something that we can call cultural redlining. Coming to the end. So yeah, there's going to be trade-offs. So I don't want to get too much into this. We can talk about this Q&A. Like, I totally acknowledge there's tons of trade-offs, the reductiveness of quantitative methods, the reductiveness of categorizing people as white, Black, and Asian, et cetera. But to me, the trade-offs are worth it. That I think economic redlining research was really great in that it raised awareness of this discriminatory practice, and it led to new policies and new legislation that I believe actually help people. And I imagine this as the work of studying cultural redlining as in some ways reductive, using scientific quantitative methods. There's going to be a trade-off. I completely acknowledge that, but I believe the trade-off is worth it in that it's going to actually help writers, particularly minority writers, is also going to help readers and people who like to read books and watch, TV shows and movies that will have better culture as a result, less grounded in racial discrimination. So really coming to the end now. So as part of this work, I had the opportunity to work with some editors and writers at the New York Times. We wrote this op-ed, which actually brings a story to the year 2020. So it was a cool opportunity to take this historical study and then push it forward. So we got a bunch of new data. We did a lot of new research and looked at how these patterns, they continued after the year 2000 up into the present moment. We found, it's still going on. There hasn't been much change. And this op-ed I wrote, you can check it out. It's called Just How White is the Book Industry. And to me, it helps to articulate more broadly what should we do. We need to change how editors are hired, how authors are recruited, how they get book advances, but also how books get read and evaluated and recognized by the gatekeepers. And then ultimately, we need to change how stories get told and what kinds of stories get to be told, particularly regarding the social world of race and society. So that's really the goal. And I think it's a mixture of scholarship, public-facing research, public-facing work, working with journalists to really start affecting real change. Okay. Okay, good. So I was hoping to leave a lot of time for the Q&A. I hope that was not too fast, but thank you again to the Brown Center um, colleagues here for letting me talk about my work. The book is called Redlining Culture, A Data History of Racial Inequality in Postwar Fiction. If you want to check it out. And again, it's paired well with this New York Times op-ed I did. The two work well together. And the New York Times article is free and it's short, so you can start there. But again, the book, this is the book. And I'm gonna stop sharing. I guess that's it. I'm good. I'm done. Marisa, I hope that was not too. I want to leave a lot of time for the Q&A. I enjoy more talking to people than listening to myself talk. So I'm happy to, anything that was too fast in the talk, I'm happy to go back into the slides. But I thought we just would, I would love to hear from you guys. So pass it back to Marisa. Thanks.
Yeah, that was wonderful. I also, here.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
Everyone. And I read the book, but it's also really great to hear you talk about it because some of the things that you just said weren't in the book in quite the same ways. But I think just for people who haven't yet had a chance to read the book, I think what's so amazing about this research and this project is it sort of, it brings at least three stories into play with each other. One being the sort of critique of the publishing industry, how it's operated using some of this data analysis, but also, for me, I'm a trained art historian. It really makes me think about how we need similar examinations of the history of the visual arts, performing arts, how are kind of all of the different cultural fields have operated. And of course, it sort of expands our, what we know and recognize about systemic racism in America, especially in this period. But I have my question for you to begin with is really about the approach that you use. And it's about sort of digital humanities and what you refer to as text mining analysis. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, having seen that you majored in, well, didn't major, your concentration was English and economics at Brown. I'm just wondering for you sort of where the interest in marrying these two fields grew from. And then if you could just share a little bit about the process behind behind this book. What does it take to do this kind of analysis? Do you need partners? Like what's the day-to-day of sort of producing a study like this? Is it, do you love it? Are there parts that are incredibly boring? Like what, sort of what's the behind the scenes of doing this kind of work for you, and how did it all really begin?
Yeah, and I want to kind of mention a bunch of resources for anyone who's interested. But but the first thing is, this was fairly recent. The econ English thing is a red herring. I hated studying economics at Brown. I really feel that the first thing I want to say is these new methods to me are completely commensurable with the things that we love about the humanities. It was actually, I read Raymond Williams' Marxism in Literature my second year with Bill Keach. And that's what really later inspired me to do this kind of work, looking at the material. Williams really talks about the material basis for cultural production, thinking about publishing, the material life of stories and books. So, my interest in this stuff is not coming from some, past history as like a failed scientist or whatever. It really comes from my love of critical theory, cultural theory that I really learned at Brown as a young person. I would say to me, it's just a tool. It's just a method. It's no different than learning about history of the book, bibliography, or even like psychoanalysis, deconstruction. It's just a different way of looking at material. It's true that it requires some retraining, but again, it's no harder than learning French or German to read Derrida or whatever. I had a chance as a professor when I was in Chicago. I was able to learn enough that I was able to do some of this on my own, but I would say there was lots of opportunities for collaboration. People in computer science, sociology, economics, people find culture really interesting. So it's very easy to find people, a lot of people would rather do this kind of work and help you do it than do another regression on employment data. It's really interesting material. So a couple of things I would say, well, first email me if you're interested in this, I can have more to say about this, but it's always easy to find collaborators if you're a professor or graduate student, and there's lots of more resources. I don't know if Dan Sinekin is in the audience, but through Post 45, they just created something called Post 45 Data Collective, where they're just collecting all these data sets around contemporary literature and arts. Also, Hadi Trust has a lot of things. So there's lots of, it's getting way easier just to get a lot of stuff to look at. And the question is then, can you learn enough on your own? Can you collaborate with someone to get into this work? But I'll say it's way easier than it seems, especially if you can find a good collaborator. And it's just again, I want to stress, I was always bad at science. I hated it. You know, there's nothing in my DNA that would suggest that I was born to do this. It just was, I just saw the potential power in this work. I really want to do it. So I found the ways that I could help myself to do this. But again, it's just a tool, it's just a method. And to me, it was no different than learning German so I could read Marx when I was like in graduate school. And I would say it's really powerful, it's really compelling. And yeah, it's often tedious too. You know, there's a lot of boring things, you know, there's a trade-off. There is some trade-off in doing more like empirical type research, but I think it's worth it. I think the question is always like, is it going to be worth it? And to me, I really want to tell a story about inequality that I think matters. So to me, doing all this stuff that I don't enjoy, like collecting data, I don't like that. Running statistical analysis in R, I don't like that. But I do like studying culture and the arts. And to me, it was worth it.
We have so many questions that are flooding in. So, but I'm keeping track of who was first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and Daniel Kim, you're first. So you can yourself.
Dan, thanks for coming out. I gave you a shout out. I don't know if you were there, but.
Yeah, I heard it. That was very nice of you, Rich. I'm very proud of you.
Thanks, man.
It's so awesome. And this project is, it's amazing and really, really sobering. And there was a number of data points that I was really struck by. So one thing I have a question about is the sort of makeup of the publishing industry overall, because like it's always had the reputation of being sort of set up for independently people with trust funds because the wages suck, right? So there's a kind of it's publishing seems to be an industry that only people with money go into who tend to be white. So it seems like there's that kind of more straightforward explanation of this huge divide. And so I was wondering about that and if that's actually true and whether that's the kind of data mining that you're doing in relation to literature could be supplemented by data mining of populations. And the other thing that I was struck by was that you were saying that in the 10% of the market, which is the prestige market, the literary publishing, that there is more diversity. And I just thought that was pretty interesting because it's because the people who are working in genres, there's the sense that they're like not taken as seriously, right? And yet they bring in most of the cash for these publishers. And if they're also predominantly white, like it does seem like it explains this narrative that one often hears around MFA programs, which is that if you're a white guy trying to write, you have a really shitty time because publishers are only going after writers of color now. So, you know what I mean? There seems to be this weird tracking about that. And I'm wondering if another thing that might be worth data mining is the makeup of MFA programs over this period, you know. And then the final thing that I was wondering about is like another myth and whether it's true or whether, and I don't even know how you would track it data-wise, but another myth I've heard is that like back in the day when the culture industry was unapologetically white and the English professoriate was unapologetically white, say the 50s and 60s, that one thing you did have was that English professors were willing to embrace their role as tastemakers.
Mm-hmm.
So so there was a porous boundary between what you and I do and what publishers do and what the editors at the New York Review of Books, you know what I mean? Like there was a kind of, it was a white boys club, but it meant that the English professoriate was sort of had a certain amount of cultural capital to establish tastes, right? So the myth is that got replaced by both multiculturalism and professionalization, so that like, Rich, the other way that you're kind of an outlier now, but I think less so as we go forward, is that you're writing for a popular audience as well, right? And you're not at the table at Random House, but you're sort of more, do you know what I mean? Like you're sort of broaching you're moving it out of the ivory tower into that world where more decisions can be made about who actually gets published. And you know what I'm saying? Like there, it seems like you could tell the story of the English professoriate that way, and actually that's how Bob Scholes, who used to be at Brown, I don't know if he was alive when you were here, but he has a book about the rise of English, and that's a version of the narrative that he tells. So that's a bunch of stuff, Rich, but I just wanted to throw that out there. And it was awesome to hear you. Good to see you.
Yeah, awesome. It's been a minute, Dan. But yeah, I'll be quick, but these are great questions. I have so much to say, but let me just move through them quickly because I think other people have questions. Yeah, the first question is really interesting. I've had people respond to this work and just be like, this probably is all true, but like maybe the problem is just capitalism, right? Like poor people are disproportionately people of color, right? They don't get to be writers, right? Writing. I think that's true, but I will say that, and there's a great recent piece in Public Books by Juliana Spark, Claire Grossman, Stephanie Young called Who Gets to Be a Writer? You should check, so Public Books, Who Gets to Be a Writer, that's looking at that problem. I would say it's true. I will say though that that problem is starting to attenuate because just becoming like, more people are having opportunities to write. You know, it's still a problem, but capitalism is still the problem. Writing still favors the wealthy favors white people. But I'm more, within that, right, how much diversity can we create within that, right? And I'm more troubled that there's a perception, right, that this gets to your second question, right, that Black writers are getting more opportunity, et cetera, right, that within this inequality of who gets to be a writer, right, that there's more opportunities for Black writers. I just want to make sure that that process can happen like in good faith, right? That we can't fix the bigger capitalism problem, right? Who gets to be a writer, right? But we like within that band, creating more tracks for people without money to become writers, this I think is the next challenge. So scholarship at MFA programs, right, et cetera. But it's always going to be the big problem with culture in general. It's going to favor the wealthy, and the class problem actually in some ways might be more severe than the racial problem in terms of cultural production. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm just more interested, like within the band of people who want to become writers, how much can we diversify? The next thing, yeah, there's I've been talking to some people that there's a new discourse where white male writers are complaining like, I can't get a book contract anymore. The numbers don't really support that, right? White male writers are still, so there's kind of like this white tears thing, right? That it feels that way only because it was so good for white male writers that, any losing of their privilege, people go batshit, right? So I think it's more an example of their privilege is attenuating, but the privilege was always massive, right? That the game is becoming more of a level playing field. So there's not a lot of evidence to show that, like only Black writers can get book contracts now. There's like no evidence towards that, even within literary fiction. Like Ben Lerner, like another Brown grad, right? Ben Lerner, people like that, they're doing fine, right? It's just that again, it's getting slightly harder for white male writers to get book contracts, but that's just more, it's just becoming more equal. It's not biased against them. So to me, that's a myth. And the last thing about really interesting question. I don't know, my own account of this is that in the 80s and 90s with the rise of critical theory, we kind of lost our taste making thing. We went from becoming like the kind of deciders of good culture to something else, right, in the 80s and 90s. And that's a little bit too bad we lost that function because we lost our connection to publishing, right? Like help shape the so yeah, I see a lot more of my colleagues in my generation, so like Merve Emery, Hua Xu, they're like everyone wants to write. This is to me it's going almost too far, right, in the other direction. But I understand where it comes from, where no longer is our position just sort of articulating radical subject positions via critical theory. It's more like, can we again kind of communicate with the public and the culture industry? And I think it's a good thing. I worry it might be going too far. Like I still think we should do academically serious work. But yeah, I totally agree with that narrative, right? That there's the pendulum is swinging back, and yeah, I'd like to be a part of that. But thanks. Awesome to see you.
Next up, we have Susanna Yim's 4th grade class, and we can see them up there who have a question. Can you guys?
Oh yeah,
there you go.
Thank you for your time, Professor Richard So. My name is Andrew, and this is Natalie. We were wondering, as we are overcoming this redlining problem, which we imagine will take a very long time to solve, Would kids all around the world and students learn about this problem? If not, how can young people address this problem? We love Toni Morrison, by the way.
Awesome. Yeah, I like Toni Morrison too. Thanks for it's so great you guys are coming to things like this. You're so much more enlightened than when I was your age. So I really admire your interest in checking out this talk. Yeah, you guys are the future. I would say the way it usually works is like, how can more young people be aware of this problem? Usually, I write academic books, I communicate with academic scholars, but I also teach, and hopefully other college professors and also like high school teachers, they'll read summaries of this book or other people talking about this book or maybe the book itself, and it'll affect the way that they teach, right? So by the time that you guys go to junior high school or high school, these ideas will penetrate more broadly through teachers, and your teachers will, pass on these ideas, right? That you will learn more about this, right? These ideas sort of migrate, right, into the classroom. And the questions are, what can you do about it? It depends. I would say the publishing world is it's just one part of the world. There's many other big parts of the world, and all these parts of the world have big racial problems, right? Like business, climate, like everything. So I would say, if you care about the arts, if you care about literature and whatever, and you want to become a writer, which is a really cool thing to do, or you want to go to publishing, be an editor, that you go in, even if you're not a person of color, that you go in with the hope that you can bring more equality, right? To, again, it comes down to hiring more, non-white editors, publishing more non-white authors, and telling more stories that represent the kind of diversity of human experience. So yeah, the way you fix a problem is whatever thing you care about, like video games, comic books, right, business, whatever, that the industry you go into, you remember that there's a ton of inequality, and whatever you do every day, you think about how you can help your profession have less inequality in whatever you do.
Thank you.
Sure, thanks.
Thanks. Jordan Pruitt, I think you are next. You got your hand up.
Hey, Jordan.
Thanks.
So,
hey, Richard, thanks so much. That was a really interesting talk. Just while you were presenting, I was really struck by the difference, which is actually quite dramatic, between the demographic makeup of publishing and demographics of authors specifically. And in the numbers you gave is actually, comparing just those two numbers, it really was publishing professionals that is the comparatively more diverse group in the period you cover. It was like 79% white in publishing, but then depending on what you look at, anywhere between 90 and 98% for authors, which is, that's just really dramatic. So I'm curious if you have, if you could just say a little bit more about that difference, if you have some sense of why, has there been, you might call it like a partial integration of publishing at the level of employment that just has not translated at the level of who's receiving the most prestige in terms of authorship. And then also, if you just have a sense of the breakdown of that publisher figure, maybe it's appears more equitable because there's a very capacious definition of, like, maybe that's counting everyone who's ever received any wage payment from a publisher, and in which case, maybe it is less dramatic that it's more.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, really interesting question. I don't know, but I can give you my kind of speculation. I think my speculation is that headcount is easier to fix, I think, with staff, because they're doing more self-accounting. They're keeping track, like HR needs to keep track of how many minority people are working. They don't do that for who they publish, right? I mean, now they're starting to. So just as an example, of how this came about, it's just simple ignorance, right? So my friend Merve, who also writes trade books, she said that the day after the Times article dropped, she got a questionnaire, right, from her publisher for the first time ever. That's what are you? Are you white? Or are you not white, right? And they had never done this before, right? And it's because they just never thought to, right? Because there's always this sort of self-idea that they're more diverse than they really are, because they're like, oh shit, we published Toni Morrison, so we must be good, right? They just weren't counting. It's really simple way to fix the problem. But But yeah, it's just that, organizations first care about their own headcount. How many Black editors, how many Black marketing people they have. So I'm not surprised that they did a better job of that just because they're aware of it. I also know that publisher, I hope there's no one publishing here, but based on my research in the archives, they just have no idea what's going on, at least empirically, what's happening. Just the kind of old style, deals based on handshakes. They're just this belief that they're enlightened, and everything is okay. To be honest, I've talked to more people like a place like Netflix, like the kind of more vulgar culture industries like Netflix and like HBO, they're way more on top of this. They're way, way more on top of this. But it's really publishing, I think, because of the legacy of being the kind of enlightened like spokespeople, for society, that they just don't think, they're just really not aware, and they really do not do good empirical self-accounting beyond headcount.
Thanks, that's really interesting.
Yeah, sorry, Jordan, were you going to say something?
No, you're good.
Oh, yeah, that's actually a perfect segue to the next question, which is from Suzanne Enzering. She put it in the chat because she has a 3-month-old nephew on her arm and he is not ready for his Zoom debut yet. But she says, thanks so much for this really interesting talk and to CSREA for organizing. The question is, you remarked that both publishers and prize committees seem to be mostly unaware of what they are doing, / the patterns of it, how it works at scale. Is your sense that since starting your data analysis and sharing the results in high-profile venues that publishers or prize committees seem ready for these conversations? Have any of them reached out to you?
Yeah, interesting question. Well, first I would say prize committees, they're more aware, but they only care when the public cares. So, so if you look at my New York Times article, you've seen that in the last 3 years, there's been way more prizes given to minority writers, and it echoes what happened in the 90s, where you see like this spike of prizes going to non-white authors. But so they're able to fix a problem more directly and care about it because they're the ones giving out the prizes, and there's only so many prizes to give out. So again, headcount is easy to take care of, but they don't always care. They only care when the public gets super pissed off about the problem. Then they will respond, which to me is not a good way to fix a problem when people are embarrassing you to fix the problem. The first. And the second thing, though, is, yeah, I'd say with some of my collaborators, Laura McGrath, Andrew Piper, we've had opportunities to talk to publishers. I just helped the PEN America with the study coming out in the fall. So I was doing some consulting with PEN America. But I was surprised. I was surprised that, ironically, before this stuff came out, I was talking more with publishers, but after I did the thing with the Times in my book, I haven't talked to them, and I don't know why. They reached out. I've offered to like share data, like do more data analysis, stuff like that. No one has got in touch with me. I know that they care because people indirectly have been in touch with me, and I've been hearing about new questionnaires and surveys and stuff like that. So I don't know. And no one's been in touch with the New York Times. So, and we actually communicated with Random House before the article dropped, their PR person, and they were very, very dismissive. And we're like, just so you know, we're going to publish this big thing like tomorrow. Do you have any comment? And they're like, oh, we're good. So I don't know what's going on. And again, like I know some of their data science people, they're not like really doing, in my mind, really forward-thinking analysis. They're doing more sales stuff. So I don't know. I've offered to talk with them and also share data, stuff like that. I know they're working on the problem. They're hiring more editors. But again, in my research, I constantly point out the way they think about problem solving, to me, is incredibly short-sighted. And there are potentially better ways to do problem solving. But I know. But there are conversations happening. I don't want to be too dismissive. And they are thinking about the problem deeply.
Yeah. Johnny Ma, you've got your hands up. If you can unmute, there you go.
Hi, Johnny.
Hi, great talk. Thanks, I really appreciate it. Definitely bought your book. But my question is, you mentioned that while you see some diversity in terms of like prestige fiction, the people who are getting published as like, stand-in for some kind of cultural movement or something, and that a lot of these same diverse authors are not getting published in more pulpy or popular genres. Do you know if there's like a qualitative difference between the ones that do get published, like the diverse authors that do get published in these more popular genres, or is it more of just the ability of people to write certain genre fiction like is not really, there's not a more diverse perspective being brought in by these diverse authors, or just like the names are changing from like Brian to like Mei Cheng or something.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would say the genre fiction by non-white authors tend to look like other genre fiction with some exceptions, right? So like Asian American sci-fi, that's becoming a thing, and that feels different than regular sci-fi. But those are outliers. I would say the problem is with something called comping, which actually there was a big Netflix post about this too. It's an interesting thing where often decision-making around like who's going to get a book contract is like comping, right? So it's like you have to look like something else, right? Because that's the best predictor of success, right? So if you're a Black writer, they're going to be like, oh, he or she sounds like Colson Whitehead, right? Or like Brandon Taylor or whatever. So the problem is if there aren't a bunch of Black romance writers, the comping won't work, right? So that's why it's really hard to be a Black writer. But comping works for literary fiction, right? So if you're a Black writer and you want to publish a book, it's your odds are better going into literary fiction because there's all these models, right? So I'm really into basketball. So like the great example is like Jeremy Lin, right? Jeremy Lin was under-scouted because there are no Asian American point guards, right, in the NBA, but there's plenty of Black point guards, right? So like there's many ways to be a Black point guard in the NBA, like Russell Westbrook, like Steph Curry. There's only one way now to be an Asian American point guard, right? So moving that metaphor to publishing, right? The bottleneck, right, is that when you don't have a model of, say, fantasy fiction written by Black or Asian American writers, right, they're not going to go for it because the publishing industry is set up to not award contracts to things that they think will succeed. And the comping problem, right, and actually I'm going to write about this, right, for a thing, right, that if that's how they make decision making, it's a really fucked up way to make decisions, right, because it literally means just replicating the status quo. That Black writers, they got to sound like Colson Whitehead. White writers, they got to sound like these fantasy or romance, like female writers, period, right? And that's how it's also bad business. Like I don't think readers and viewers, they like that, right? They don't want endless streams of white romance, Game of Thrones, like a Black Game of Thrones would be fucking awesome, like the system is not built up to train a writer to do that and then reward that writer. So that's what needs to change.
Thank you.
Sure.
If we can just go a couple minutes late, Brian, I know you've got a question, and then after that, maybe we can close out.
Yeah, thank you for your work. Can you hop back to what you were saying about kind of the comparison between the literary kind of publishing industry and other media-like industries?
Yeah.
I think particularly what you were saying about like the self-perception as enlightened, and kind of maybe going back to what you and Professor Kim were saying about like the idea of taste as this like its own kind of source of cultural capital.
Yeah.
I think as someone who like is a writer, is in the humanities, and then is also an editor at a journal, it's like really interesting that so many people are talking about the same problem, but it seems like from different angles, and like it seems like no one's really talking to each other. And I'm wondering if that problem is particular to like literature writ large, and like whether it has to do with the self-perception of literature as like a particular kind of enlightened project.
Yeah, I'm like a hardcore Bourdieuian, so like, literature as, the dominant, like basically the field that is the furthest from commerce, right, tends to lean the most on like things like taste and like elevation of quality and things like that. I tend to believe that's true, right, that people in literature, whether professors or editors at big publishers, they feel the most, less pressured by the demands of commerce, so they feel like their decision-making is based on like enlightenment, right? That they are the spokespeople for society, right? That they publish books to help society, right? They're not just trying to make money, right? Like Netflix or like Hollywood studios. And yeah, my own view is I think that self-perception has insulated them from some serious self-auditing, right? Looking at problems of racism. And again, with the known quantities problem, right? That there's always alibi, right? That they can always say, well, we published Toni Morrison, we published Colson Whitehead, so we're good, right? Look how many copies they sold, look how many prizes they won, right? So we're good, right? And so I think this kind of numerical auditing is really important, to kind of for like a reckoning, right? And again, like talking to people in other industries in the entertainment biz, they're just more on top of this, they have less pretensions about their own the purity of their decisions and their own enlightenment. I think it's just true, and partly because they just have less money. So to be fair, Netflix has way more money than Random House to do these kind of projects. But if they want to claim to be the most enlightened of the culture industries, they have to back it up, right, with evidence, right, but also with practice.
I guess one question is, with the numbers that you're showing in this kind of analysis, I tend to work more on preservation in a very similar sort of critical approach to thinking about the preservation field and what it does. And I think for, when you're looking at these kinds of numbers, you have to start asking yourself, to what extent are these fields, is it not just a coincidence of what they do and what they protect and what they're putting out there, but to what extent do you have to start to say it is part of the mission of the field, that white supremacy is part of the mission? Because if you're looking at numbers the way you kind of shown us, I think you almost have to ask that question, that it's not just a sad accident or a number of factors interplay with each other. But if it is part of, in some ways, like the kind of unacknowledged mission of some of these fields, it's hard to think about how you make minor changes on the side but keep the field intact.
Yeah, I would say, most of these organizations, it's not implicit, they put out public statements that they support Black Lives Matter, that they support diversity. So it's completely hypocritical for them to not implement practices, that align with their explicit mission statements, which again, they've all released in the last year, that they support Black culture, right? That they support racial diversity. So yeah, it's no longer an implicit thing that they're explicit about it. So they have to pursue practices that support that mission statement. And yeah, I would say, for publishers especially, where a lot of their perceived self-value is in doing good things for society, right? And they believe that they are more pure in some ways than, like, say, Netflix or Hollywood, because they're less motivated by profit, is especially incumbent upon them. And I find it depressing that like, I'm also I'm interested in sneakers, like sneaker person, right? That like, I'm dispirited by that, like, Adidas has been more aggressive in figuring this out, hiring more sneaker designers, right? Like working with Beyonce, people like that, than publishers, right? That sneakers are totally profit driven, but they put out a similar mission statement and they're really backing it up, and they're doing a really good job. So, I find it dispiriting that ostensibly more capitalism driven industries like sneakers or like Netflix, they've actually been better than publishers. And they've all articulated, again, the explicit mission of supporting Black culture, Black lives, and so, et cetera. So to me, it's not an if anymore. It's like, how are they going to do it?
Yeah. All right, well, we're a little over our 1 hour slot here. I just wanted to let people know there's a lot of information in the chat box, including the link to the song that was playing when you came in, but a link to the book, a link to some of the articles and projects that Richard mentioned in the conversation, a note about future programming. And so with that, I just wanted to give Richard the last kind of few words to close us out.
Oh, I'm seeing all these things.
To thank him. Hold on. On behalf of everyone here today, and there are a lot of people and a lot of good questions, I also just wanted to thank you for being here. And I know CSREA, of course, is thrilled to have you. And thanks for being here, but also thank you for your research. Thank you for the years and years it takes to produce a book like this. It's, sort of moving the way we think about culture and hopefully moving the culture industry. So thank you for that.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much to the center. Marisa, thank you for a great job of moderating this. I had a lot of fun. Thank you all for giving up your lunch hour to talk with me. I just want to say, first, so many awesome comments. Sarah, we'll talk. I just saw your comments, Sarah. But I just want to say quickly that if you are a scholar, professor interested in this kind of work, please email me. I'll just say that there's a misperception that people work in this new field, cultural analytics, because it's sciencey, that it's intimidating, it's exclusive. I found it to be the opposite, that all these people work in this area, it's the most inclusive, welcoming group of scholars I've ever been a part of. It's like the exact opposite of my usual experience in the humanities. So please email me. There's a lot of active conversations on Twitter between a lot of distinguished people in digital humanities like Ted Underwood, Andrew Piper. These are really generous people who want more people to enter this field, especially women and minorities. So jump in, just cold email people. This is a really welcoming community, and I would love to hear from you if you're interested. But I just wanted to debunk, debunking myths, just this idea that somehow this new field is exclusive, it's really male, it's really like, bully, like Silicon Valley bro. It's the exact opposite. And we're trying to bring in more people working on these problems around inequality, social problems, especially from women and minorities. So please be in touch if you have any questions or you find this kind of work interesting. I'd love to hear from you because we want to make this field grow and become bigger. So thanks a lot though for joining me today.